All right, well, now we're going to learn a little bit about the Constitution itself. Just a quick review. If you remember, we started out with the development of government and why government was necessary. We looked at some early forms of government. We looked at some of the different philosophers and their view on how important it is for the people to actually have a voice. We saw how the colonies ultimately rebelled against an absolute monarch of George III of Britain. We have looked a little bit at the Declaration of Independence and the key pieces of that, discussing the importance of the rights of man, the importance of that every single citizen or every single person has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that pursuit of property. We saw the real first attempt at a constitution with the Articles of Confederation and how miserably they failed. And so what we see with the Constitution is a document that essentially outlines exactly how our government is to function. What's interesting is the document that we're going to actually look at, and we're not going to look at it here, but really hasn't been changed too much. Yes, there have been amendments that have been added. Yes, there are some different interpretations, but essentially this is the same document that was written in 1787 that we still use today. So let's go ahead and take a little look. First look at here is we'll look at the preamble. And what the preamble is the preamble is basically an introduction. And the key words that are listed here, and we'll read through them here in a second, really set the stage for some of the key concepts that are included within the Constitution itself. Many of you I know have probably, if you want to play the Schoolhouse Rock video below, still an incredible video. I watched it when I was a little kid, usually Saturday mornings on Channel 6, ABC. Enough reminiscing. But what I'd like to do is I'm going to read this and talk about one key word in here. But we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, what's interesting about this is there's one key word that I want you to kind of look at, and that is the word ordain. Ordain is a word that, when this document was written, ordain tends to have a meaning of like you ordain a priest or you ordain a monarch, essentially giving sovereignty, whether it's over spiritual matters or over political matters, to someone or something. So in this case, in the preamble where it says, do ordain and establish this Constitution, essentially what we're doing is, by placing this word ordain in there, we are establishing that the Constitution is essentially king of our nation. And as we look a little bit further in, we'll begin to see how this document really guides everything we do. And when you step out of line, when you begin to take a different path, it's the Constitution that ultimately pulls you back. So let's go ahead here and let's look at the articles. Now the articles are basically like chapters. And you'll notice that we have 7 chapters here. And each of these articles, each of these chapters really sets out specific jobs, roles that members of government must undertake. But then we see near the bottom some guidelines and rules that ultimately are that need to be followed when we want to begin to change it. So the first one, if we look at Article 1, it's the legislative branch. The most important thing that you need to remember is the legislative branch writes the laws. Now, the Article 1 establishes a multitude of specific jobs that Congress must or has the power to partake in. And we'll talk about it a little bit later. I seem to say that a lot, but specifically, Congress shall have the power to coin money. Congress shall have the power to regulate trade. Congress shall have the power to declare war. So a lot of these specific express powers are written in Article 1. You'll notice Article 2 is the executive branch, symbolized by the president. However, the executive branch is the largest branch within our government. The Army is included, the large bureaucracy is included in the executive branch, but it's the president that ultimately leads the executive branch. Whereas in Article 1, the legislative branch had a lot of specific jobs. The executive branch doesn't have as many. I think, and through research and my understanding, is that the early founders of our republic really didn't want to handcuff the executive, but at the same time didn't necessarily want to give too much power to the executive branch. And so they really limited the power. It's only recently, and usually through acts of conflict or war, that the executive branch really carves out extraordinary powers. And once you carve it out, it's very difficult to give back those powers. The Article 3 deals with the judicial branch, symbolized by the Supreme Court. Probably the least written about within the Constitution. And this is a branch that really had to kind of carve out its place within our government. The early founders had really struggled with understanding the role that the judicial branch would actually play. Some specific examples would be the Supreme Court ruling that an act of the legislative branch is unconstitutional. But that doesn't come around till 10 years after the Constitution is actually written. I failed to mention back with Article 2 that the legislative branch in Article 1, Congress writes the laws. In Article 2, the executive branch, they enforce the laws or they carry out the laws. And it's Article 3 in the judicial branch that reviews or judges the laws. And essentially what the Supreme Court does, and again, we will study this when we study the judicial branch, is that the Supreme Court has the ability to judge laws and acts of government whether or not they follow the Constitution. Article 4 deals with how do we add more states. Article 5 deals with amending the Constitution. How do we, if we want to add to it, if we want to change something, what's the process that we go through? Article 6 deals with the Supremacy Clause. The number one thing you need to remember there is that essentially the Constitution is supreme. Nothing is higher in authority than the Constitution. And then Article 7 deals with ratification. How did, once the delegates went back to their states, how were they to kind of convince the people of their state to agree to this document? So there's a process for ratification. We will talk about some of the other parts, specifically the Supremacy Clause in Article 6, but the three that we're really going to want to pay attention to are the first three. Let's go ahead here. And so with the amendment process, the first 10 amendments, and again, an amendment is like something that is added afterwards. The first 10 amendments are what are called the Bill of Rights. We see these were written by or included by James Madison. He was one of the early writers of or one of the early contributors to the Constitution. But the Bill of Rights were kind of included because, again, there was a great fear as to whether or not the national government was going to have too much power. All of the delegates had come from a time where they were very fearful of this absolute power that existed within the national government, specifically Great Britain. And so the first 10 amendments were included in there to make sure that the individual was protected from the government. And so, as you see in number 2, the protection of civil liberties from the government. And again, this is something later that we will certainly talk about, but liberties, again, is the idea of freedoms. So these are the protections of individual civil freedoms that the government cannot take away. You probably know quite a few of these already. The First Amendment, you have freedom of religion, assembly, press, petition, speech. Now, are these rights absolute? In a way, yes, but also in a way, no. The government can restrict your rights. Freedom of speech. Can I say whatever I want? Certainly. Can I say bomb in an airport? Not so much. The other thing we need to remember is that the Bill of Rights were included because of this fear of this national government. So there were some states that were not going to sign on unless these individual freedoms were protected from the government. And then we see that the Bill of Rights today, they're constantly evolving. We saw earlier, we were discussing same-sex marriage. The early founders had no concept of same-sex marriage. But as society has grown and wanted to include more and more individuals and given more individuals equal protection under the Constitution, the Bill of Rights and the rights that we possess has actually grown. Some would argue they've actually decreased, but that's a whole different argument. And then we have some other amendments. So these are really 11 through 27, and you don't have to remember these right now, but understand that, for example, voting requirements have changed over time. The 15th Amendment guaranteed that black males could vote. The 19th Amendment included all women could vote. The 26th Amendment added 18 to 20-year-olds that could vote. There was an early push, I shouldn't say early, but at the turn of the century in the 1900s, there was a big push for abstinence. And so people were really pushing towards prohibition of alcohol. And what we see is the 18th Amendment made it illegal. 21st Amendment brought it back and said it was legal. And then we see the 14th Amendment, and this is one that we will come back to quite a bit. The 14th Amendment, actually what it does is it provides citizenship to the former slaves, but it also, there's a key provision in there that provides equal protection under the law. And what it really does is it applies all the rights guaranteed in 1 through 10. It essentially guarantees that those rights now are applicable at the state level. And so that's really important to kind of keep in mind.